You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 20th of February 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up in the next 60 minutes... After the impeachment, the criminal trial of South Korea's President Yoon Suk Yeol begins. We'll be live in Seoul for the latest from the hearing. Also coming up, the Middle East scrambles to come up with an alternative plan to Donald Trump's proposal to clear Gaza of Palestinians and turn the Strip into a beach resort. But will they create a lasting strategy, and will it ever happen? Our fashion editor will bring us the latest ahead of London Fashion Week, and we'll look at the papers. Plus,
the world watched fires devastate Los Angeles earlier this year. Now, can Frieze LA help bring the city's artistic community together?
We'll find out what to expect from Frieze Los Angeles. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a quick look at what else is happening in today's news. Donald Trump has denounced the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky as a dictator without elections and said he'd better move fast to secure peace with Russia or he'll have no country left. The bodies of 4 hostages to be taken by Hamas are expected to be returned to Israel later today. And the US is to cut the size of its diplomatic mission in China by up to 10%, with American diplomats being handed their notice as early as Friday. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, in another legal and political first, albeit an unwelcome one, a South Korean criminal court is currently holding the pre-trial hearing of Yoon Suk Yeol on charges of leading an insurrection. The case dates back to the brief few hours in early December, during which martial law was imposed. Meanwhile, at the country's constitutional court, the impeachment trial of President Yeol has been drawing to a conclusion, with lawyers arguing that he could impose martial law once again if he's allowed to resume his role. Well, I'm joined now by John Nilsson-Wright, head of the Japan and Korea Programme and Centre for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge here in the UK. And from Seoul, Steven Borowiec is staff writer for Nikkei Asia. Very good afternoon to you, Steven. Good morning, John.
Good morning.
Steven, may I begin with you? And we're mid-afternoon now. We're just after 4 o'clock in the afternoon in Seoul. What's been happening so far today?
It's been a busy day for Yoon and for, I think, the law enforcement officials here in the South Korean capital. Around 10 o'clock this morning, Yoon attended the first hearing in the criminal trial where he's facing charges of insurrection. And then after that, his prison vehicle motorcade drove north over the Han River up to the Constitutional Court, not far from where the Nikkei offices are, and had to traverse a very kind of elaborate setup that the police have up there. I took a walk over there earlier this afternoon and I talked to some of Yoon supporters who were holding a big rally there. That aspect, these are two kind of concurrently but separately moving things. The Constitutional Court is set to rule on the soundness of the impeachment, whether Yoon will be able to return to office or whether he'll be removed. And we're hearing that a decision on that will be coming fairly soon, perhaps early next month. So today was a big day, but we couldn't interpret it as a kind of step towards perhaps finally reaching some kind of resolution here.
Thank you for that, Stephen, for that update. John, just listening to that, obviously an astonishingly busy day for the president, especially with the motorcade transporting him between trials. Just focusing on the criminal aspect of this, he's charged with insurrection, and this is one of the few charges that a South Korean president does not have immunity from, isn't it? Punishable by life imprisonment or even execution, although that is an absolute remote possibility.
Yes, that's right. And this is the first case where we've had a sitting South Korean president involved in a criminal trial, forced to account for extraordinary behaviour. Obviously, these two separate measures the constitutional process, which is a political kind of assessment of the political decisions of the National Assembly, and the criminal case, which is really looking closely at his actions, puts him in real jeopardy. And I think the evidence at the moment seems to suggest, I think balanced opinion would suggest that when the Constitutional Court rules and removes him, as I think they will, from the presidency by upholding that impeachment decision, this criminal case will become much, much more important. And the president's position is a difficult one because I think there has been so much testimony that is not necessarily very clear, conflicting from members of his government, members of his cabinet who have testified in various contexts about whether or not this action was justified or not, and whether they knew about it. And of course, this is all happening in a context in which South Korean politics is very polarized between supporters of President Yoon and others who believe that the impeachment action was justified, given the gravity of the martial law declaration. So it's a difficult situation for President Yoon. He's been under arrest for a number of weeks now, but he seems pretty defiant, and his lawyers are trying to do a number of things. One is which is to cast doubt on the legitimacy of these claims, and in the case of the political trial, the Constitutional Court, to question the bona fides of the justices who preside at that very important court and the basis for their decision, suggesting that they are biased in favour of progressive opinion.
Steven, you mentioned the protesters that Yoon Suk Yeol will have driven past on his way to the criminal court. Just recap for us just how deeply the effects of the power grab have been felt. I mean, it's the 3rd of December when he briefly imposed martial law. At the time, he was claiming that pro-North Korean communist forces had infiltrated parliament, were trying to overthrow the country. He had no evidence for this. But what appears to have happened is that those who support him have now been whipped into an absolute frenzy.
Yeah, and you hear less about that, the initial impetus that Yoon cited when he gave that address on the night of December 3rd. They're now talking a lot more about these theories of electoral fraud. So if you pass these crowds, you see a lot of them are holding placards that read in English, "Stop the Steal," which is, a slogan that has been adopted from electoral fraud conspiracy theorists in the U.S. And some of these folks that I've talked to have really picked up on these theories that are circulated in right-wing YouTube, primarily here in South Korea, that the NEC, the National Electoral Commission, has been kind of co-opted by the opposition and by China and North Korea, and that these legislative elections that were held in April of last year in South Korea, in which Yoon's ruling People Power Party fared quite poorly, they lost most of the contested seats, that this was all stolen via hacking measures and other kind of untoward things. It's funny that it's, kind of one very obvious hole in this story is that even though this is something that this side of the conversation has settled on, Yoon did not mention this at all when he was initially giving his rationale for martial law. So this is all very kind of, if you worry about the stability and the overall integrity of the South Korean political system, this is a kind of worrying trend that you have this, not a majority by any means, but you have this fairly sizable portion of the electorate that has gone into this direction of believing these unsubstantiated theories. These theories are still not something that have penetrated the mainstream media or mainstream institutions, but so this movement that is supporting Yoon, they still do have the kind of aura of a fringe movement around them, but it is quite big. And as we've seen in previous episodes of this saga, where they have attempted to assault journalists and physically prevent Yoon from being arrested. So there is a bit of tension in the air as the country awaits a kind of conclusion here.
And John, how worried should we be about the stability and integrity of the South Korean political system, given what Steven has just talked about? This idea that people are going onto YouTube, shunning mainstream media, accusing the authorities of allowing the Chinese to influence last year's elections. And indeed, there's a fear of North Korea as well.
I think we should be very worried about this. We've seen a growth in support of those people backing President Yoon, and the kind of direct action that they're taking, street politics and attacking buildings and institutions and individuals. And of course, if, as I think is likely, the Constitutional Court upholds the impeachment decision by the National Assembly and Yoon is removed from office, we will then be in an electoral cycle. There will need to be a national election within 60 days. And the suspicion has been that the governing PPP, the People Power Party, is trying to capitalize on this widespread widespread is perhaps too strong, but this prominent public distrust of the court, and to exploit that to enhance their position going into that election. So in a way, the PPP seems not perhaps dissimilar from the experience of the Republican Party in the United States to be moving ever more rightwards in terms of its willingness to entertain some of these more outlandish conspiracy theories. For example, we've seen lots of efforts through YouTube to disseminate very salacious and unfounded rumors regarding the behavior of the justices on the Constitutional Court, including the Chief Justice. None of this is based on fact, and the attempt to discredit what is, after all, an extraordinarily important part of the institutional framework of South Korea is very worrying. And in all of this, I think the depth of emotion that is fueling some of these protests can't be underestimated. It's part of a trend that we've seen not only, of course, in South Korea, but of course globally. And this is part of the populist playbook, which politicians, unfortunately, are all too willing to exploit to advance their own narrow partisan interests.
John Nilsson-Wright and Steven Borowiec in Seoul, thank you so much for joining us on The Globalist. Just nudging 10:13 a.m. if you're listening in Riyadh, 7:13 a.m. here in London. Now, having hosted the first face-to-face meeting in 4 years between Russia and the US this week, Saudi Arabia now becomes the location of another crucially important gathering. Government representatives from Saudi Arabia, but from Egypt, Jordan, Qatar and the UAE will come together to discuss a plan for Gaza. It's a countermeasure to the proposal by Donald Trump to clear the strip of Palestinians and to build a beach resort there instead. Well, I'm joined now by Bill Law, Middle East analyst and editor of Arab Digest. Welcome back to Monocle Radio, Bill. Good to have you with us.
Good to be here, Emma.
What is Egypt's plan? I mean, it's been described in certain circles as a scramble.
Yeah, well, I think scramble is the word for so much of what is going on in the world right now. And certainly in the Middle East, the Egyptian plan calls for a reconstruction. It would involve the Gulf states in terms of funding. It would prevent any effort to remove the Palestinians, certainly by force or by any other means, really. It's an attempt to block this push that's come not only from the Israeli government and the extreme ministers in that government, but also from Donald Trump, of course, to effectively ethnically cleanse the Palestinians, some 2 million people, from the Gaza Strip. And the Egyptians, and Sisi in particular, do not want the Palestinians to be forced into North Sinai. They can't manage it. It would cause all kinds of eruptions politically and otherwise economically. So what the Egyptians are doing, as the rest of the world is they're scrambling. They're trying to find alternatives. And I think that it's going to be an interesting gathering of these 5 states presided over by Mohammed bin Salman. He will be looking for opportunities to push forward what the Saudis say is their plan, which would involve the 1967 peace deal, a Palestinian state, that is cohesive, connected, and viable along those 67 borders with East Jerusalem as the capital. That's what he's called for, and that's presumably what will come out of this meeting. But there's going to be a lot of horse trading that'll go on that I think is going to be interesting to watch.
Neither Palestinians nor Israelis are going to be at the table. Why is that?
Yeah, well, I can understand why the Israelis would not be at the table. The omission of the Palestinians is an interesting one. In part, I think it reflects the divisions within Palestine itself. You have the Palestinian Authority, which is being pushed forward as a replacement for Hamas. But who do you invite? If you invite one, do you invite the other? Clearly, you can't invite Hamas. So I think they took the decision to keep the Palestinians out. However, I have to say that there should have been some Palestinian representation. There may be some on the sidelines. We don't know the details of that. But once again, I think the Palestinians are being the ones who are being pushed aside while these great power politics are being played out.
Is there any likelihood that that any plan that is formed by the Saudis, the Egyptians, Jordan, Qatar and the UAE will actually be accepted? Because we've already seen the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio holding meetings in Saudi Arabia on Monday, pushing for Donald Trump's plan. There is the sense from Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, that the Trump plan is something that he espouses. One wonders just how useful or productive this plan is or could be.
Yeah, well, you're right about Marco Rubio because he came to Riyadh. He met with the Saudi Foreign Minister, Faisal bin Farhan. He met with Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, and he essentially said, as you said, that the plan is the Trump plan, Riviera on the Mediterranean, the removal of the Palestinians. He didn't use the word ethnically cleansed, but that's what it would amount to. And he said to the Saudis, look, if you've got another plan, then give it to us, and we'll look at it. What will that plan involve? I think that we need to look for words. For example, if the Saudis and these other nations come up with the pathway to nationhood, that's a signal that they're not really that committed to the Palestinians. However, if they reassert that there must be a Palestinian state, and they put it unequivocally and in clear and strong language that references the ethnic cleansing aspect, that references the number of civilians killed in the war thus far, the genocide that's been carried out by the IDF. If it's a tough statement, then we can say, well, you know what, this is a determination by these five nations to secure a deal for the Palestinians. But if it simply says there must be a pathway, the Palestinians have heard that pathway story before. That just means kicking it down the road. That means the Palestinians will not get what they desperately need and deserve, which is a Palestinian state. What
role does Saudi Arabia play in all this? Because they're clearly keen to play host. They may indeed have Donald Trump's ear as a result of this. But they have said that they will reject any plan that displaces Palestinians from their land. That said, they were very close to establishing ties with Israel 2 years ago. It all appears to hinge on which direction Saudi decides to go. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's a very good way to put it, Emma. Mohammed bin Salman is right where he wants to be, which is seen as the leader of the Arab states. That situation was perhaps somewhat different if you go back a few years, and the killing of the journalist Tamal Khashoggi, which was tagged to Mohammed bin Salman. But he has restored his image and he's working on diplomacy. What does he want to see out of this? Well, I think that he'll look at the situation and say, what's good for Saudi Arabia? What can we best get out of it? If the Palestinians' card can be played and played hard and proves fruitful, then I'll play it hard. On the other hand, if that card is not going to secure me much credit or is not going to achieve a result, perhaps I need to not play it that hard. I think you'll look at it in a very transactional way. We use that word a lot now, don't we? And we shouldn't forget that right now, as we're talking, this future investment initiative, this is the efforts to get foreign direct investment in Saudi is happening where? In Miami. which is interesting. They usually have it in Davos in Saudi Arabia, but sorry, not Davos. It's called Davos in the desert. They have it in Riyadh, and they've moved it to Miami. Interesting situation there. So there's a lot of, Trump has blown up the world order. The cards are still fluttering through the air. It's going to be interesting to see where they all fall in the next even few days, and certainly the next few weeks.
Bill Law, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. Still to come on today's programme.
Symbolically, it's very important. I mean, it's one thing for Elon Musk to go on his X and interview Vidal and say Alternative for Deutschland is a great thing. But when the Vice President of the United States does something similar, it has a very different weight and resonance.
We'll focus on this weekend's elections in Germany and ask what influence the US could have on the way people vote. Stay with us on The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
8:21 in Zurich, which is where we head now to look at today's newspapers. Joining me from there is Gorana Gergic, Monocle's security correspondent. Good morning, Gorana. How's Zurich looking this morning?
Good morning, Emma. It is rather grey, but it's supposedly going to be a little bit warmer today than the past couple of days. So we might see around 12 degrees Celsius, which is very balmy, given that we've been in deep minuses for the past couple of days.
Positively tropical. We look forward to the swimsuit pictures. Gorana, tell us what's happening in the news. I think a lot of people have been knocked sideways, as ever, by the latest statements from Donald Trump on whatever subject. But this one, when he explained, he accused Volodymyr Zelensky of being a dictator and saying that he wasn't elected and that he started the war with Russia. There's been quite a lot of fact-checking in the press, hasn't there, just to establish what is actually the correct version of events?
Absolutely. So I think there's been a transatlantic collaborative effort in fact-checking. So everyone from CNN to BBC and in between, various print media also engaged in fact-checking all of these claims that Donald Trump just threw out there in that post yesterday that then set off a really kind of back and forth between US and Ukraine. So this obviously was prompted by Zelensky saying that Trump lived in a disinformation space that was created by Russia, to which Donald Trump really held no punches in his Truth Social post yesterday. So all of the media actually went through that I mentioned, at least all of the media went through every single claim from Zelensky, allegedly, according to Trump, being a dictator without elections, to having 4% approval ratings, all the way to, I would say, the most serious charge that basically was Ukraine that started the war, rather than what we saw happen really on 24th of February in 2022, or even if we want to go much further in history beyond that, obviously, with the annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass in 2014.
How important is it for the media to step in and do fact checking, given the fact that narratives are being rewritten at absolute breakneck speed?
That's a great question. And I think that there is worth in debunking. There's also a worth in pre-bunking, even when things come out that actually they don't stick, that we have the story set straight. Because again, on some of these charges that are now coming from Washington, it's really hard to see how there could be any trust left between US and Ukraine, given what Donald Trump is saying really brings into question U.S. support as a whole to Ukraine, if this is the stance that they hold at the moment, the present administration.
Let's move on to another story that you wanted to draw our attention to in The Guardian, which is Meta is announcing plans to build the world's longest underwater cable project connecting the US, India, South Africa, Brazil and other regions. an enormous project, but that sudden realization that those cables which connect us and which are operated often by the public sector and which are set up by governments and connect nations is going to be in the control of an enormous private company.
That's precisely the angle that I wanted to take. So this project Waterworld, which involves cable longer than the Earth's circumference, and that, as you said, reaches as far as South Africa, Brazil, and India, so basically touching 4 world's continents, is something that I think a lot of us should be looking at through this prism of what's been going on actually in a completely different region of the world, and this is the Baltics, where we've had so many of these issues with undersea cables and acts of sabotage that have allegedly been linked to Russia's actions over in that part of the world. And now the fact that, again, we see that this is something that is being executed by a private company that ultimately will affect a lot of governments, and that we didn't necessarily have a conversation about some of these things, just a couple of years ago about the resilience of undersea cables. But nowadays they are high on top of the agenda of NATO meetings, of various governments talking about their resilience, what you can do to actually protect these cables, whether they're used for communication or whatever sort of purpose in the kind of infrastructure and connectivity they serve. But certainly this project, which is touted to enable greater economic cooperation and facilitate the digital inclusion, also can be made vulnerable and can itself become a target if, again, we see the kind of competitive relations between states continue.
Finally, let's look at how people are using retail as a political statement. That we have, I think earlier on this week, we had the number of sales of Tesla cars dropped significantly in Europe and the UK. I mean, really did drop. I think it's a 60% drop. In the United States, Americans are deciding what they will and will not buy, depending on their political position.
That's absolutely right. So politics is everywhere, and everything is politics. We, I think, already established that through the very lengthy U.S. presidential campaign, but now a new poll that was just conducted over the past month or so in the United States found that 4 in 10 Americans have shifted their spending to align with their moral views. And it's quite interesting that this sentiment is especially felt by younger Gen Z consumers, as well as Black and Democratic consumers. So most notably, some of the supermarket chains, for instance, or convenience chairs that have announced that they were ending some of their diversity, equity, and inclusion policy, the DEI, that is so vilified by the Trump administration. Those companies are now seeing less of the Black and minority and younger consumers shop there.
Gorana Gergic, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio down the line from Zurich. The time here in London is 7:28 a.m. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A quick look now at what else we're keeping an eye on today. Donald Trump has denounced the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky as a dictator without elections and said he'd better move fast to secure peace with Russia or he'd have no country left. In response, Volodymyr Zelensky accused Donald Trump of living in a disinformation space created by Moscow. The bodies of 4 hostages to be taken by Hamas are expected to be returned to Israel today. The Palestinian militant group said the bodies of 2 boys, Kfir Bibas and his brother Ariel, and their mother, Shiri Bibas, along with that of a 4th hostage, will be handed over under the Gaza ceasefire agreement. The United States is to cut the size of its diplomatic mission in China by up to 10%. The South China Morning Post reported that American diplomats working in mainland China and Hong Kong might be given notice as early as Friday. And the Vatican says the Pope's condition has stabilised. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni visited Pope Francis yesterday in hospital in Rome. She said the pontiff was jokey as always. The 88-year-old is being treated for pneumonia. And those are the headlines on Monocle Radio. Time now for a view courtesy of one of our editors, a fresh Monocle take on the news, let's say. Let's hear now from our Toronto bureau chief, Thomas Lewis, and he brings us a story of how intelligent architecture is transforming the coast of Lake Ontario.
Early birds in Toronto, willing to brave the brisk winter mornings, have a new vantage point from which to savour the sunrise at Lake Ontario. Watch is a long wood-slatted resting wall of sorts, which has been installed in the sand at Woodbine Beach in the city's East End by the US designer Trey Horn. Its lake-facing, canted facade allows beachgoers to take pause and to lean on the structure as they soak up the sight of the rising sun. This is just one of 6 architectural designs that's been unveiled along Toronto's longest stretch of public beach this week for this year's edition of Winter Stations, Canada's annual international design competition, which was launched back in 2014. Each year, architects and designers are invited to reimagine the lifeguard lookouts that are stationed in the sand by transforming them into warming huts more appropriate for the season. Among this year's other winning designs is an oversized listening cone propped up on a lifeguard station and designed by French designers Inès Descent and Tonan Letondu. Visitors are invited to wander inside to listen to the amplified, exaggerated sounds of the lake and the beach around them. Since its launch, Toronto's annual Winter Stations competition has ensured that a beloved public space which bustles each summer has year-round appeal. This year's designs are on view until the 30th of March. For Monocle in Toronto, I'm Thomas Lewis.
Thank you, Thomas. For more from Monocle's editors and correspondents, sign up for our daily newsletter, The Monocle Minute, at monocle.com/minute. Now, London Fashion Week is just about to begin, so for a preview, let's hear from our fashion director, Natalie Theodosi. A very good morning to you, Natalie.
Good morning, Emma.
Good to have you with us.
Always a pleasure.
Tell us what your big, excited anticipations are from London Fashion Week.
So this season in particular, London Fashion Week, the schedule is quite small. I was sad to see one of my favorite designers, Jonathan Anderson, is not part of the schedule this time. So there's not as much to see. But so what I am excited about is the younger designers that London is really known for. So tomorrow morning, I'm going to see the show of the designer Stephen Stocky Daily, which is an interesting brand. He started with menswear and he looks at a lot of those British tailoring traditions. He's recently added women's wear to his line. And there's also some real favorites in the calendar from the women's wear world, which is Simone Rocha, an Irish designer who's always really romantic, really whimsical. Emilia Wickstead, a designer from New Zealand who has really built a crowd of her own here in London. And also Roxanda, who is Serbian but has established her own brand here for over a decade. So it's a nice diverse mix of people.
The names you mentioned, though, Simone Rocha, Emilia Wickstead, and to a certain degree Roxanda, are quite British focused, aren't they? Would I be right in thinking? Whereas you mentioned J.W. Anderson not showing in London, still connected to Loewe, but one wonders just how inward looking London is becoming.
I think it is becoming a lot more inward looking. It's also before, thanks to the likes of Jonathan Anderson, Burberry had a much wider reach. So we would get a lot of international visitors as well. So the buyers of all the big American and Japanese department stores, a lot more international editors. So it really did feel like a global gathering, and it's very similar to what Milan and Paris Fashion Weeks still feel like. But now it has become more localized, and the brands, they do business abroad as well, but it is much more difficult being independent. So like you say, it has become more inward looking.
And where does that leave London?
That is the big question, Emma. I think the whole industry needs a big reset. The good news is that the British Fashion Council has nominated a new CEO, so new perspective, new ideas coming in. I think it's really a case of finding ways to support the current designers and make sure that there's talent coming in and that it's possible for them to work there. There's grants, but also mentorship, whether it's financial, giving them support with all the different ways that a brand needs, whether it's merchandising, photography, everything. I think what people are saying is that there is a bit of lack of support. So they've been going to Paris and Milan to show.
And what, therefore, can we look out for in terms of brands which are exciting?
So I think the brands that I just mentioned, there is another menswear brand that we will be seeing this weekend called Denzel Patrick. And I'm also keeping my eye out on a designer called Pauline Dujancourt. She's a real knitwear expert and she does things by hand. She's an artisan and she was nominated for the LVMH prize last year as well. So I think she's a great one to watch. Our Chiltern Street neighbor and the retailer Maria Lemos is also a big fan, and I always listen to what she has to say.
And let's look ahead now. If we are to leave London and it's Fashion Week next week, where do we turn our focus to next? Back to Europe.
It is back to Europe. So from next Tuesday, Milan kicks off and then Paris. So that's where the schedules do get a lot busier, and industry professionals from all over the world start flying into Europe and kind of getting together. So I think that will be interesting. There is it is a transitionary period for the industry in general. We'll see Milan will start with Gucci, which will show a collection by its design studio. They still need to name a new creative director. So there's a lot of those conversations going on. And I think there will be a lot of behind the scenes guessing and gossiping about what's really happening at these design studios when we get to Milan. But it is part of the fun, and I think it will be interesting to see what finally happens when those key positions are filled.
We look forward to it. Natalie Theodosi, Monocle's fashion director, thank you so much for joining us on The Globalist. Germany faces federal elections this weekend, and among those looking on closely was the US Vice President J.D. Vance, who tore a strip off Germany and Europe at the Munich Security Conference, shunned Olaf Scholz, and instead went and held a meeting with the far-right Alternative für Deutschland leader Alice Weidel. Well, at the Munich Security Conference, Monocle's Andrew Muller met the New York Times chief diplomatic correspondent in Europe, Steven Erlanger. And Andrew began by asking what he made of J.D. Vance's appearance there.
I mean, it could have been worse. In the sense he could have blasted them more on Ukraine, on NATO, on spending, which he didn't. Instead, he gave a kind of political speech as if he were the program director of the Orban Institute, of far right. It felt very deeply political and for him very personal, but it's just different when you're the Vice President of the United States. I think this is what caused quite a lot of confusion. And for the Vice President of the United States to interfere so directly and, frankly, with so much hostility into an ongoing German election campaign and a real democratic ally of the United States, I think that struck many people as bizarre and rude and very, very undiplomatic, which I think would probably make Vance very happy. But it was a shock, I think, for a lot of people in the room. And then you saw the German defense minister, Boris Pistorius, immediately try to challenge it rather than staying silent. So I think that stood him in good stead for the campaign, to be honest. But you could also argue it's true what he says, but the biggest danger to Europe does come from within, but it comes from the far right, which is the very group he's supporting.
Well, yes, that also seems to have played fairly badly in a lot of German media, the fact that he made a point of meeting with Alice Weidel from Alternative für Deutschland, but did not bother to take the time of Chancellor Olaf Scholz.
Yes, that's true. And he had met Scholz before, but it was pretty obvious, symbolic. I mean, he's a busy guy. He did see Zelensky. I mean, it's not like he was doing nothing. But to meet Vidal, whose party, the AfD, was not even invited to this conference because it's considered in large part anti-constitutionalist, nor was the Tsar-Wagner party invited, nor were the Russians invited, it should be said. And symbolically, it's very important. I mean, it's one thing for Elon Musk to go on his X and interview Vidal and say, gee, it's a great thing, the alternative for Deutschland is a great thing. But when the Vice President of the United States does something similar, it has a very different weight and resonance.
I mean, do you detect any particular rhyme or reason to what Vance and this administration generally have been doing in Europe's direction in the last few weeks? Are they trying to make it clear to Europe that you're on your own at this point?
Not quite on their own. I do think it's meant to put a shot across the bow to say, we actually mean what we've been saying, what many American presidents have been saying, that you're awfully rich and you should be able to take care of your own defense for the most part.
None of which is actually an outrageous suggestion.
No, not at all. And, Trump has felt since he was 1980s in New York that our allies, American allies, take advantage of us and we protect them, and they use the money they save to build up these nice golden social welfare benefits, and the United States is a chump and just playing a sucker. He's said that in 1987, 88, 89, long before he thought of becoming president. And these obsessions stick with him, as does his deep offense even then at all the foreign cars in American streets, right? The German cars, then Japanese cars too. So these are consistent obsessions he's had, and I think he now kind of feels empowered to kind of do more about it.
I mean, it does remain to be seen whether that this is at last the wake-up call that Europe decides to listen to, and I don't unfortunately think that considering that question will get us very far. But I did want to ask about your views on Germany in particular, a country which has been a reluctant military power for 80 years for all the obvious reasons. But 80 years on, is it not about time that Germany got over itself in this regard? And do you see that there's any chance at all of that happening?
I think it is happening slowly. I mean, this whole notion that, Germany's altruistic and doesn't pursue its own interests has been wrong for a long time. I mean, Angela Merkel followed Germany's interests. Now, this government has done too. But its interests under this government have been more about the United States than about Europe per se. I do think the past, which we all know about, pretty horrible, memory culture matters, and as a foreigner, I'm very reluctant to criticize it. I think it's very important that Germans remember and know and take responsibility for what happened. But it's not this Germany, it's not this generation. And when it's used as a pretext for not taking a responsible role in the world, I think it's tacky. And then when it's used in the other way as a pretext for sanctimony, I think it's also tacky. I mean, once I said to the German ambassadors' conference, there's a whiff of sanctimony coming off the Spree River, and it's deeply unpleasant.
And that was Steven Erlanger of the New York Times talking to Andrew Muller at the Munich Security Conference. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Let's enjoy a roundup of all the news from the Mediterranean. The Athens-based journalist Emmanuel Papavasiliou joins me on the line. A very good morning to you, Emmanuel.
Oh, hi, Emma. Good morning.
Good to have you with us. Just explain to us, so bring us up to date, because I think in Greece we have the run-up to the second anniversary of the train disaster in which, almost 60 people, most of them young people, died.
Yeah, so this is shaping up to be one of the biggest actual challenges yet for the Greek government, who for its tenure has, enjoyed a lasting, peace so far. But this particular issue really has struck a chord with the Greek public. So next week, as we mentioned, on the 28th marks 2 years since the Tempe train crash, which killed exactly 57 people. Many of them were young students in their 20s. And it was Greece's deadliest rail disaster. But, beyond the tragedy itself, the public outrage has basically been driven by how the government has handled this aftermath. So there have been accusations of covering up the investigation into what happened, though nothing has been officially proven. And a recent poll found that 8 in 10 Greeks disapprove of how the case has been managed. So now in January, so last month, there's been a massive protest. So there were tens of thousands of people demonstrating in over 100 cities. And I think next week we should be expecting similar scenes. So there will be a 24-hour general strike. And the public sentiment, unfortunately, has started to turn a little bit mistrustful towards the government response and its defensive stance about it.
This unhappiness and this government response, their dissatisfaction with it, what exactly are they accusing the government of getting wrong?
Basically, the government from their side, as a first response, has promised rail safety reforms and legal accountability. But many people feel that these steps have been so slow and inadequate. And, the fact that protests are still this large 2 years later shows that trust hasn't been restored at all. It's been sparked now because there's been new evidence, like new videos, CCTV videos that have emerged from the scene from investigators. And people are asking, why are we releasing these videos now? Where were these videos before? Like, what is happening? And in fact, there's been a lot of conspiracy theory coming out of it. But the government response has been very defensive from their side with unclear messaging. And it has really sparked this thing of people asking for clear answers and accountability. It's a deep issue just because it was basically, young people being killed and families is a big issue in Greece. So people want answers and they're just weirded out by the government response.
Let's talk about tourism. And the headlines in the last couple of weeks have been dominated by earthquakes in Santorini, 10,000 people leaving, big fears about the way that the island will manage this year's tourism, given the fact that it's about now that people start booking their holidays. Where does that fit in the wider scope of how Greek tourism is heading?
Yeah, look, Santorini is like a big stable for Greek tourism. In fact, when everyone thinks of Greece abroad, it's probably, an image of the caldera or like Santorini. And yes, it's a big thing, but it's not. Santorini is not the most important aspect. In fact, it has taken its image has taken some damage from last year, first of all, because last year it faced criticism for overcrowding and infrastructure struggles. And now there's been a lot of earthquakes, which may prevent people booking for the summer at the moment. But Greek tourism this summer sees really, big news. In fact, the big thing this summer is going to be we're expecting a record number of American tourists to come over. There's going to be about 100 weekly flights scheduled from the US this summer for this summer season, with a lot of new direct routes. And specifically and most importantly, there's going to be a brand new route from LA to Athens direct starting on the 3rd of June. And I mean, this is really welcome news because, for European arrivals might fluctuate this year, but we're going to have a stable American market. And it's going to be, I think, a really good and stable driver for the Greek tourism sector this year. And whatever happens with Santorini, now fears are being dampened down. Seismologists are actually saying that there is no volcano because that was the biggest fear about it. And although it has been hit hard, I think it's going to rebound. Is a big, major part of tourism. And we have this American anchor from one side. So I think Greek tourism is okay for this year.
Glad to hear it. Finally, let's talk about the soft power or problems associated with entering a song into the Eurovision Song Contest. One would think it was so simple. The rules are simple. Don't be political. This isn't happening for the Greek entry this year, is it?
Yeah, I always love some Eurovision drama, and, without it, it will be boring. But here's the thing. So Greece has unveiled this Eurovision entry. The reaction has been very underwhelming at home, but it's been controversial abroad. So the song is called Asteromata. It's performed by Klavdia. She is a singer of Pontic Greek descent, and it themes around refugees, displacement, that sort of things. And, the controversy comes from Turkey, where the state broadcaster TRT, after seeing this song, has suggested that it may be a reference to the Pontic genocide, and they will investigate it. So now the Pontic genocide is a historical event that Turkey does not officially recognize, whereas Greece does. And in fact, it's not a surprising reaction because looking at Greek-Turkish tensions and rivalries, their tensions and rivalries about history and historical memory often spill into cultural arenas such as Eurovision. But really, domestically, I mean, the Greeks, they really don't care about the political angle at all. They just find the song and performance really boring this year. It's a really slow song. The dance troupe doesn't do a lot more than lying on the floor and barely moving. And it's important because for many Greeks, cultural events such as Eurovision are about public face. What will the international community say about them? And this entry doesn't seem to be exciting them at all. So the diplomatic controversy will definitely fade in time, but I don't think this entry will go far this year.
Emmanuel Papavasiliou, thank you so much for joining us on the line. You're listening to Monocle Radio. This is The Globalist. Finally, on today's programme, the International Art Fair Frieze Los Angeles returns to Santa Monica Airport this weekend. Like its stablemates Frieze London, Frieze New York and Frieze Seoul, the fair is a showcase for contemporary art at the absolute highest level. Joining me in the studio is Sophie Monaghan-Coombs, Monocle's Associate Editor for Culture. Good morning, Sophie.
Good morning, Anna.
How's culture?
Yes, it's great. I'm enjoying it, although I haven't seen you this early in the morning for a while.
It is delightful to have you back in the studio. So let's talk about Los Angeles. So everything that's been coming out from LA over the last few weeks, award season coming up and people doing what they can around the fires. How much were the Los Angeles fires a threat to something like Frieze happening?
Well, I think the art world were very surprised that it went ahead. About a month ago, the organisers of Frieze LA put out a statement that said it would be happening. But I think that came to a surprise to many people, especially many people I was speaking to. This is only the 6th edition of Frieze LA, so it's a very young fair. And I think there's sort of two sides about, regarding whether it would go ahead that are important. One is the sort of practical side, the damage that happened to venues, infrastructure, accommodation and artworks. I was emailed about an artist based in Altadena whose works were completely destroyed in the fires. So his solo show will now feature 3 artists. So there's that very kind of practical element. But I also think it's whether it feels right, at the heart of art fairs they are about wealthy people buying artworks for their walls, and some people kind of question whether it's the right thing that LA needs right now. So I think the organisers will have to strike a very delicate balance this week.
Indeed. I mean, you raise the absolutely crucial question that the people who would ordinarily be going to Frieze Los Angeles will have much more serious and pressing things on their minds. That actually whether Los Angeles is in the room for has the mentality for luxury retail at the moment, or is it just a question of timing? Had they waited a little bit longer, people might have had a sort of slightly bigger spring in their step.
I think it's difficult because the kind of art fair sort of carousel is so packed and the schedule is so packed. You kind of can't shift these things around because everyone is doing this and then they're gearing up to go to Art Basel in Hong Kong and so on and so forth. So I think it's a bit kind of sticky in that way. I also think one thing that hasn't been kind of spoken about that much is climate change, and scientists have said that climate change did make the fires in LA worse, and fairs aren't very environmentally friendly at their heart. You're bringing in lots of people, you're shipping in all these artworks. So I hope that that's part of the kind of conversation that's happening this week in LA.
And is there any sort of response from the fair about the whole context and of the fires?
Yes, definitely. I think that's something that they couldn't avoid. So since January, Frieze have donated 10% of all new ticket sales to the LA Arts Community Fire Relief Fund. They very early were a contributing founder and funder into that fund. So I think that's been very important. There is a lot of emphasis on spotlighting local artists, fundraising campaigns, community rebuilding. And there are other sort of initiatives like the Victoria Miro Gallery will open their stand, and they will be inviting other galleries and dealers to donate artworks to them, which they'll then sell in order to give money back to the community. So it's really about kind of shifting the focus, I guess, this year from sort of selling being the main part of it, and instead it's about community rebuilding. How do we support artists at this really tricky time?
Frieze is often quite good at this. I think just they have a section in it called Focus, don't they, where they talk about solo presentations by galleries who have a local space either in LA or across the United States, and they have to be quite young. I think they have to have only been in existence since 2013. They get a little bit of they get a bit of money off the stand rent as well. Is there a sense that something like Frieze is actually going to step up in this new way of not just rescuing those who've been devastated from the fires, but actually does invest in future art?
I hope so. Frieze has, as you say, it has a very good reputation for this already, for supporting smaller galleries, and that becomes absolutely crucial now. You know, I think for blue chip galleries who are very happy to kind of eat costs of participating at these fairs without necessarily having their best sales figures, that's okay for them. For smaller galleries who maybe had to take a big financial decision to take part in Frieze, maybe it's their debut year, and then there's, all this question about whether people are going to go. It's very likely that sales will not be very strong this year, and they might not be able to kind of balance those costs, and that might be completely devastating for them. So I think, Frieze really need to do as much as possible to support those galleries and support local artists, and so far it does look like they're stepping up.
Sophie Monaghan-Coombs, great to have you back in the studio. Thank you so much for joining us on The Globalist. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to the producers Laura Kramer, Chris Chermak and Hassan Anderson. Our researcher was Maisie Ringer. Our studio manager was Elliot Greenfield. After the headlines, more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday here in London. The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.